If you're enjoying this video, smash that like button, subscribe, and hit the bell. Share it with your friends, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Every like and subscribe helps the channel grow. My name is Marcus Reynolds. I'm a park ranger here at the Okefenokee Swamp in Georgia. It's not the kind of place most people would choose to live, but for me, it's perfect. The swamp is quiet, isolated, and full of life, if you know where to look. I've spent years studying reptiles here, snakes, turtles, alligators, you name it. I guess you could say I know this place like the back of my hand. I didn't come here just for the science, though. After Vietnam, I needed somewhere far away from people. The war left me with a metal plate in my skull and migraines that hit me like lightning strikes sometimes. But it wasn't just the pain. I needed space to breathe, to escape the noise of the world and everything that came with it. The swamp gave me that peace, or at least it did for a while. This summer was different. The drought had dried up parts of the swamp that hadn't been seen in decades. Cypress trees that were usually hidden beneath murky water stood tall and exposed, their roots twisting like skeletons reaching out for help. It was fascinating at first, a rare chance to explore areas untouched by modern hands. I spent days documenting what I found: ancient indigenous artifacts buried in the mud, carvings etched into cypress knees that looked older than anything I'd ever seen. Some of them were warnings, though I didn't know what they meant at the time. Symbols and patterns that made my skin crawl, even though I couldn't explain why. Harold Turner, an old fisherman who ran tours for tourists, loved to tell stories about the swamp's mysteries. He'd sit on his boat and talk about the one beneath the waters, some kind of monster that only came out during droughts like this one. People laughed it off as folklore, just another tall tale to keep visitors entertained. I didn't believe him either, not really, but something about the way Harold spoke stuck with me. He wasn't joking or trying to scare anyone. He seemed serious, almost afraid. Still, I brushed it off and kept working, making notes about everything I found and filing them away for my research. But deep down, something felt off about this summer. The swamp wasn't acting right. The animals were moving out of their usual territories, even though food was easier to find with the water levels so low. And my migraines, they were getting worse every time I went near certain parts of the swamp. At first, I thought it was just stress or exhaustion from working too hard in the heat. But soon enough, I'd realize it was something much more sinister. A few weeks into the drought, things started to go wrong. It began with the disappearance of 3 college kids. They'd rented a canoe for a weekend trip into the swamp, but they never came back. Their families called the ranger station and we sent out search teams right away. I was part of the group that found their canoe. It was overturned near one of the deeper channels, stuck in the mud like it had been tossed aside. At first, we thought it might have been an accident. Maybe they hit a log or got caught in a current. But then I saw the claw marks. They were long and deep, carved into the wood like something had grabbed hold of the canoe and ripped it apart. I've seen alligator attacks before, but this wasn't the same. The marks didn't match anything I'd ever seen in the swamp. We searched for days but found no sign of the kids. No footprints, no gear, nothing. The only thing we had was water samples from around the canoe site. When I tested them back at the station, they didn't make sense. The chemical composition was strange, almost like there were toxins in the water that shouldn't be there. And then there were the hallucinations. A few of the rangers who went out to search started saying they felt dizzy or saw things that weren't there. Shadows moving in the water or flashes of light just beneath the surface. One guy swore he heard voices calling his name from somewhere deep in the swamp. I didn't tell anyone, but I started feeling it too. Every time I went near certain areas, my migraines would flare up worse than ever before. The pain was so bad it blurred my vision, and sometimes I thought I saw shapes moving through the trees or patterns floating in front of my eyes like smoke. The animals were acting strange too, birds flying away from their nests, turtles abandoning their usual basking spots, even alligators avoiding certain channels they used to hunt in every day. It was like something was pushing them out, something they didn't want to be near. Harold Turner stopped running his tours altogether. He said he wasn't going back into the swamp until things settled down. When I asked him what he meant, he just shook his head and muttered something about the old stories. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was happening wasn't natural, not just drought or bad luck, but something deeper, something dangerous. And yet I kept going back out there every day searching for answers, even though part of me didn't want to know what I'd find. Things got worse after that. The swamp felt alive, but not in the way it usually did. It wasn't the hum of insects or the croaks of frogs. It was something else, like the swamp itself was watching, waiting. One night, I was out on patrol with a couple of the junior rangers. We were checking the deeper channels near where the canoe had been found. The moon was bright and the water shimmered like glass. It should have been peaceful, but it wasn't. We heard splashing up ahead, like something big moving through the water. At first, we thought it might be an alligator, but then we saw it. Lights, soft, glowing patterns just beneath the surface, swirling and shifting like they were alive. "Do you see that?" one of the rangers whispered. I nodded, my hand tightening on my flashlight. The lights moved closer, slow and steady, like they were trying to draw us in. One of the rangers stepped forward, like he couldn't help himself. I grabbed his arm and pulled him back. "Don't," I said firmly. "Stay together." The lights disappeared as quickly as they'd come, leaving nothing but ripples behind. We didn't see anything else that night, but none of us could shake the feeling that we weren't alone out there. The next morning, a woman named Elizabeth Winters showed up at the station. She was a rescue specialist, sent to help with the search for the missing students. Elizabeth was sharp and no nonsense, the kind of person who didn't scare easily. But even she looked uneasy when I told her about what we'd seen in the water. We decided to focus our search on the areas where I'd been having migraines, the places where everything felt wrong. That's when we found it, a cave system hidden by years of water and mud, but now exposed by the drought. The entrance was small, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through, but inside it opened up into a massive chamber. The walls were slick with algae, and the air smelled damp and sour. Scattered across the floor were pieces of shed skin, thick and scaly, like something out of a nightmare. Elizabeth picked up one of the pieces and held it up to her flashlight. "This isn't from any animal I've ever seen," she said quietly. Neither had I. In one corner of the cave, we found carvings etched into the stone, patterns that matched the ones I'd seen on those cypress knees weeks ago. Elizabeth stared at them for a long time before speaking again. "This isn't the first time this has happened," she said finally. "There was an incident back in 1932 during another drought. 3 people went missing in this swamp under similar circumstances. What happened to them?" I asked. "They were never found," she replied grimly. "We kept searching, and eventually stumbled upon something, or someone. I'll never forget one of the missing college students, sitting against the wall of the cave with wide, unblinking eyes. He was alive but barely responsive, his skin covered in strange geometric patterns that glowed faintly in the dim light. Elizabeth knelt down beside him and tried to get him to talk, but all he did was mumble in some language neither of us recognized. When he wasn't speaking, he'd scratch those same patterns into the dirt over and over again like he couldn't stop himself. "We need to get him out of here," Elizabeth said firmly. We carried him back to the ranger station and called for medical assistance, but deep down I knew no doctor was going to be able to explain what had happened to him. That night, as I lay awake in my cabin staring at the ceiling, I couldn't stop thinking about those glowing patterns in the water, or the carvings in the cave, or that student's empty eyes. Something ancient had awakened in this swamp, something that had been waiting for decades beneath its surface, and whatever it wasn't done yet. The next few days were a blur of fear and confusion. The student we rescued, his name was Daniel, was taken to the hospital, but he didn't get better. The doctors said he was physically fine, but mentally, it was like he wasn't there anymore. He just sat in his hospital bed, mumbling and scratching those same patterns into anything they gave him. A notepad, the sheets, even his own skin. Back at the swamp, things were getting worse. The bioluminescent lights were showing up more often, moving closer to the ranger station at night. The animals had almost completely disappeared by now, leaving the swamp eerily silent. Even Harold Turner packed up and left town without saying goodbye. Elizabeth and I decided to go back to the cave to look for more clues. It felt like the only place that might give us answers. We geared up and headed out early in the morning, hoping to get in and out before dark. The cave was even more unsettling the second time around. The air felt heavier, like it was pressing down on us. As we moved deeper inside, Elizabeth stopped suddenly and pointed her flashlight at the ground. "Marcus," she whispered, her voice trembling. I followed her light and saw what she was looking at. Fresh tracks in the mud. They were huge, shaped like a cross between a human foot and an alligator's claw. Whatever made them wasn't far ahead. We pressed on cautiously, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. That's when we heard it. A low, guttural growl that echoed through the cave like a warning. My heart pounded as we turned a corner and came face to face with something I'll never forget. It was standing in the shadows at first, its glowing skin casting faint patterns on the walls around it. It looked almost human, but wrong. Its body was covered in thick scales that shimmered like oil on water, and its eyes glowed with an unnatural light that seemed to pierce right through me. Elizabeth froze beside me, her flashlight shaking in her hand. "What is that?" she whispered. Before I could answer, the creature stepped forward into the light, revealing its full form, a nightmare of teeth, claws, and sinewy muscle, built for hunting in both water and land. It let out a sound that was somewhere between a hiss and a roar, and I knew we had to run. "Go," I shouted, grabbing Elizabeth's arm and pulling her back toward the entrance. The creature moved fast, faster than anything that size should have been able to, but we managed to squeeze out of the cave just in time. We didn't stop running until we reached the boat. Back at the ranger station, things went from bad to worse. That night, during a violent storm, the creature came for us. It started with strange noises outside, scraping sounds on the walls and windows that made my skin crawl. Then came the lights again, those hypnotic patterns swirling just outside the station like they were calling to us. Elizabeth was the first to fall under its spell. I found her standing by the door with a blank look on her face, humming some strange tune I'd never heard before. Her hand was on the doorknob, ready to open it. "Elizabeth," I shouted, shaking her out of it. She blinked a few times and looked at me like she didn't know where she was. "It's trying to get inside," I said urgently. "We have to stay together." But staying together wasn't easy when it could mess with our minds like that. The creature attacked not long after that, smashing through one of the station's windows with terrifying strength. Two of my junior rangers tried to fight it off but didn't stand a chance. It tore through them like they were nothing. Elizabeth and I barricaded ourselves in one of the back rooms, but we both knew it was only a matter of time before it got to us too. That's when I realized something. My migraines, the ones that always flared up near certain parts of the swamp, they weren't just random pain. They were warnings. The metal plate in my skull must have been interfering with whatever it used to control people's minds, because while everyone else seemed completely helpless against its hypnosis, I wasn't. I told Elizabeth my theory as we scrambled for supplies to defend ourselves. "There has to be something it's afraid of," I said desperately. She nodded and started flipping through old ranger logs while I searched for anything useful in our storage room. That's when we found it. A note from decades ago about native herbs used by local tribes as protection against evil spirits in the swamp. We gathered what we could, herbs from our supply closet and some copper wire from an old radio, and set up a makeshift barrier around what was left of the station. For now, it kept us safe. But how long could we hold out? The storm raged outside, lightning flashing through the windows and thunder shaking the walls. The creature was still out there, circling the station, testing our defenses. Every now and then we'd hear it scrape against the barricades or let out that horrible growl that made my chest tighten. Elizabeth was pale and trembling, but she was holding it together. "We can't stay here," she said. "It's only a matter of time before it gets through." She was right. The herbs and copper had slowed it down, but it was smart. Too smart. It had already cut off our escape routes and sabotaged the water supply. It wasn't just hunting us. It was trapping us. I thought about the fire tower a few miles away, an old abandoned structure we used to monitor the swamp during wildfire season. It had electrical equipment that might still work, and if we could lure the creature there, Maybe we could use it to stop this thing once and for all. We'll make a run for the tower, I told Elizabeth. It's risky, but it's our best shot. She nodded, her jaw tight with determination. Let's do it. We waited for a break in the storm before making our move. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the swamp was still dark and dangerous. Every step felt like a gamble, like the creature could lunge out of the shadows at any moment. Elizabeth carried the herbs while I kept the copper wire wrapped around my wrist like a lifeline. We moved as quickly as we could through the mud and tangled roots, using my knowledge of the swamp to avoid its traps. When we finally reached the fire tower, my heart sank. The place was falling apart. Rusted stairs, broken windows, and equipment that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. But it would have to do. We climbed to the top and started setting up our trap. I rigged the old generator to send an electrical current through the copper wire while Elizabeth spread the herbs around the perimeter of the tower. We worked fast, knowing we didn't have much time before it found us again. And then we heard it, the growl echoing through the trees closer than ever before. "It's coming," Elizabeth whispered, her voice shaking. The creature appeared moments later, its glowing patterns cutting through the darkness like a beacon of terror. It moved toward us slowly at first, almost cautiously, but then it charged, climbing up the tower with terrifying speed. "Now," I shouted. Elizabeth threw herself into its path, holding out a bundle of herbs like a shield. The creature hesitated for just a moment, long enough for me to activate the trap. Electricity surged through the copper wire, lighting up the tower in a blinding flash. The creature let out an ear-piercing scream as it convulsed and fell from the tower into the swamp below. When I turned back to Elizabeth, she was lying on the floor, barely conscious. "You did it," she whispered weakly. Her eyes closed for good before I could say anything else. The swamp was quiet again after that night. Too quiet. The creature was gone, but it had left its mark on the swamp, on the ranger station, and on me. When the authorities arrived, I told them everything about the glowing patterns, the cave, and the creature itself. But they didn't believe me. They chalked it all up to alligator attacks and stress-induced hallucinations. Even Elizabeth's sacrifice was brushed aside as an accident. I didn't argue. What was the point? No one wanted to believe that something like this could exist, but I knew the truth. I spent weeks combing through old records, piecing together every incident that matched what had happened here. Disappearances during droughts, strange sightings, unexplained patterns carved into trees and stone. The stories went back centuries, even to the time of Spanish explorers. Every single one pointed to the same thing: this creature wasn't gone for good. It hibernates, waiting for the right conditions to wake up again. Low water levels, astronomical alignments, and who knows what else. And when it does, it feeds. I couldn't let it happen again. I set up monitoring systems throughout the swamp, motion detectors, cameras, water sensors, anything that might give me an early warning if it ever came back. I started training new rangers to recognize the signs, the carvings, the lights, the patterns in the water. Most of them thought I was crazy, but I didn't care. As the months passed, the swamp returned to normal, or at least as normal as a place like this can be. The animals came back, and so did Harold Turner with his fishing tours and tall tales. But I never stopped watching. And now, as I stand here teaching a new group of rangers about the swamp's dangers, I see it. The water levels are rising again after 43 years of normal conditions. It's only a matter of time. My name is Daniel Morrison. I'm a park ranger stationed in the boundary waters of northern Minnesota. It's February 1958, and the cold this year feels like it's trying to bury the world alive. The thermometer outside my cabin broke yesterday. It froze solid at -61 degrees Fahrenheit. I don't need it to tell me how cold it is, though. The air bites harder than any winter I've ever known. I live alone out here, miles away from the nearest town. The isolation suits me fine. After losing my wife to tuberculosis 6 years ago, I didn't want to be around people anymore. The silence of the wilderness is comforting in a way. It doesn't ask questions or expect answers. It just exists, like me. Most days I keep busy with my rounds, checking trails, monitoring wildlife, and making sure no one gets lost out here. Not that anyone would willingly come this far north during a winter like this. Even the Ojibwe families who usually fish on the frozen lakes have packed up and left weeks ago. That's unusual for them. They know these lands better than anyone. If they're gone, there's a reason. The animals are acting strange too. Wolves haven't been howling at night, which is unsettling. They're usually loud this time of year, calling to their packs across the frozen woods. Deer are migrating south even though the snow is deep and heavy. It's like they're running from something. Yesterday, I found a frozen rabbit lying in the snow, perfectly preserved but untouched by scavengers. Even the crows wouldn't go near it. I keep a journal to write down things like this: odd behaviors, strange occurrences, anything that feels out of place. It helps me stay grounded out here, especially when the days blur together in endless white and gray. I also sketch wildlife sometimes. It's a habit I picked up during the war when drawing helped me escape the ugliness of what I saw. This morning started like any other. I brewed coffee on my wood stove and layered on enough clothes to make me feel like a walking pile of blankets. My rounds took me along the edge of Blackwater Lake where I noticed something odd. No tracks in the snow, not even mine from yesterday. It was as if the wind had erased everything overnight, but there hadn't been any wind. I stopped by an old fishing shack near the lake and found it abandoned, though someone had clearly been there recently. A bucket of ice fishing tools sat untouched by the door, and inside was a half-eaten sandwich frozen solid on the table. It felt wrong somehow, like whoever had been here left in a hurry without finishing their meal. As I stepped outside, I felt it again, the cold that wasn't just cold but something deeper, heavier, unnatural. My breath froze in front of me almost instantly, forming tiny crystals that hung in the air longer than they should have. I decided to head back to my cabin early today. Something about this place was gnawing at me, a feeling I couldn't shake no matter how hard I tried. The next morning I woke up to a crackling sound on the radio. It was one of the few connections I had to the outside world, though the signal was always weak this far north. I adjusted the dials until a voice came through, faint but clear enough to understand. 3 researchers from the University of Minnesota have gone missing near Blackwater Lake. Last contact was 2 days ago. Search teams are delayed due to weather conditions. Blackwater Lake, that was less than 10 miles from my cabin. My stomach tightened as I listened to the rest of the report. Missing people out here in this kind of cold didn't stand much of a chance unless they found shelter fast. I grabbed my gear, snowshoes, rifle, and extra layer, and headed out. The wind had picked up overnight, and the snow was falling in thick, heavy flakes that made it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. The trail to Blackwater Lake was eerily quiet. Not even the crunch of snow underfoot seemed loud enough to break the silence. When I reached the lake, I spotted their campsite right away. 3 tents were set up near the tree line, but something about them felt off. They were sagging under a layer of snow, and there were no signs of movement or life around them. I approached cautiously, calling out, "Hello, anyone here?" My voice sounded small against the vast emptiness of the frozen lake. No answer. The first tent I checked was empty, except for some scattered supplies, a sleeping bag, a flashlight with dead batteries, and an open notebook lying on its side. The second tent was much the same, abandoned in a hurry, as if whoever had been inside didn't have time to pack up. It wasn't until I reached the third tent that I found something truly unsettling. A pot sat over a cold fire pit outside, its contents frozen solid mid-boil. Inside the tent were plates with half-eaten food on them, also frozen stiff. It was like they had been interrupted in the middle of dinner and just vanished. I picked up the notebook from the first tent and flipped through it. It belonged to one of the researchers, a geologist named Dr. Thomas Palmer. Most of it was dry scientific notes about soil samples and ice formations, but toward the end, his handwriting became shaky and erratic. Hunger. It's all I can think about now. One entry read, "It's like my stomach is eating itself alive." Another page said, "The guide is acting strange. He won't stop staring at us while we eat." The last entry sent a chill down my spine. We shouldn't have stayed here. Something is watching us. I closed the notebook and scanned the area again. That's when I noticed something in the snow, footprints leading away from the campsite toward the woods. At first glance, they looked normal enough, Footprints about the size of an average man's foot, but as I followed them deeper into the trees, they began to change. The prints grew longer and narrower with each step until they no longer looked human at all. By the time they disappeared into a patch of untouched snow, they were stretched so far apart it would have been impossible for anyone to make them without running on stilts or something worse. The air around me grew colder as I stood there staring at those tracks. My breath came out in short, sharp puffs that froze almost instantly in front of me. The trees creaked and groaned under the weight of ice, but there was no wind, not even a whisper. Something wasn't right here. I decided it was time to head back to my cabin before nightfall. Whatever happened to those researchers wasn't something I could solve alone, not without more supplies or backup. But as I turned to leave, I heard it for the first time, a faint whisper carried on the still air. It sounded like my name, Daniel. I froze in place, every hair on my body standing on end. The voice came again, clearer this time, but still soft and distant. Daniel. It sounded familiar, too familiar, but there was no one else out here except me. I didn't wait to find out who or what it was. I started walking back toward my cabin as fast as my snowshoes would let me, trying not to look over my shoulder even though every instinct told me something was following. By the time I made it back to the cabin, the sun was already dipping below the horizon. The temperature dropped even further, and the cold seemed to seep through every layer of clothing I had on. My hands were shaking, not just from the cold, but from what I'd seen. Those footprints. That voice. It didn't make sense. I bolted the door behind me and stoked the fire in the wood stove until it roared. The cabin felt small and fragile against the vast frozen wilderness outside. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching me from just beyond the tree line. I tried to distract myself by writing in my journal, but my thoughts kept drifting back to those researchers. What could have happened to them? And what was it that I heard in the woods? My name spoken in a voice that sounded so much like my wife's, but that was impossible. She'd been gone for years. The radio crackled to life again, pulling me out of my thoughts. The signal was weak, but I could make out a few words. Search team delayed, worsening conditions. Stay indoors. Then it cut out completely. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the flames in the stove, trying to calm my nerves. That's when I heard a sound outside, a faint crunching of snow like footsteps. My hand instinctively went to my rifle, which was propped up against the wall next to me. "Hello?" I called out, my voice steady but quiet. No answer. I stood up slowly and moved toward the window. The glass was frosted over, but I could just barely make out a figure standing at the edge of the clearing. Whoever it was looked thin, too thin, and they weren't wearing any heavy winter clothing. They just stood there, swaying slightly, like they were struggling to stay upright. "Hey," I shouted this time, louder than before, "do you need help?" The figure didn't respond. Instead, it turned and started walking toward the cabin with slow, uneven steps. As they got closer, I realized it wasn't just one person, it was two. No, three. They were all moving together now, their heads tilted at odd angles, as if they were listening for something. I backed away from the window and grabbed my rifle. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Then came a knock at the door, soft at first, but growing louder with each hit. "Please," a voice called out from outside. It was weak and desperate. "Help me." I hesitated for a moment, before unbolting the door and cracking it open just enough to see who was there. A man stumbled inside and collapsed onto the floor, shivering violently. He was emaciated, his cheeks sunken and his eyes wide with fear. His clothes were torn and caked with frost, and his hands were covered in scratches that looked self-inflicted. "Close. Close. The door," he gasped between ragged breaths. I slammed the door shut and bolted it again before kneeling beside him. "Who are you? What happened?" "Dr. Thomas Palmer," he managed to say before breaking into a coughing fit. It took me a moment to realize who he was. The lead geologist from the missing research team. He looked nothing like his photo in the notebook. This man looked like he hadn't eaten in weeks. "They're gone," he whispered hoarsely. "All of them gone. What do you mean? Gone where? He shook his head violently and grabbed my arm with surprising strength. It's here, he said through clenched teeth. The hunger. It's inside us. I didn't understand what he meant, but before I could ask more questions, he passed out on the floor. That night was one of the longest of my life. I gave him some water and what little food I had left, dried meat and hard biscuits, but he barely touched it. By morning, things got worse. I woke up to find Palmer sitting at my table, gnawing on one of my wooden spoons like it was a piece of meat. His lips were cracked and bleeding from biting too hard, but he didn't seem to notice or care. Palmer, I shouted, pulling him away from the table. He looked up at me with wild eyes that didn't seem entirely human anymore. It's coming, he said in a low voice that sent chills down my spine. What's coming? I demanded. He didn't answer me directly. Instead, he started laughing softly to himself, as if he'd just heard some dark joke that only he understood. Later that day, I discovered some of my food supplies were missing, half a bag of flour gone without explanation. Palmer denied taking it, but his lips were dusted with white powder when I confronted him about it. That night, I caught him trying to eat his own fingers. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear Palmer shifting around in the cabin, muttering to himself. His voice would rise and fall, sometimes sounding like a man, other times like something else entirely, something guttural and inhuman. At one point, I caught him staring at me from across the room. His eyes were wide and unblinking, his lips cracked and trembling. He wasn't the same man who had stumbled into my cabin the day before. Whatever had happened to him out there in the wilderness had hollowed him out, leaving something else behind. By dawn, the snow started falling harder. The wind howled like a living thing, battering against the walls of the cabin. It was a full-blown blizzard now, and there was no way I could leave, not with Palmer in this state. I tried talking to him again, hoping to get some answers. Palmer, I said carefully, keeping my distance. What happened to your team? What's out there? He didn't respond at first. He just sat there, rocking back and forth on the edge of his chair. Then, without warning, he stopped moving and looked up at me with a strange smile. It's hungry, he said softly. It's always hungry. What is? I pressed. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. The Wendigo. I froze at the word. I'd heard stories about the Wendigo before, old Ojibwe legends about a spirit that possessed people during harsh winters when food was scarce. It would drive them mad with hunger until they turned on each other, consuming flesh to survive. But those were just stories, weren't they? Before I could say anything else, Palmer's body jerked violently, like he was having a seizure. He fell to the floor, writhing and clawing at his own skin. His screams were unlike anything I'd ever heard, raw and animalistic, filled with pain and rage. I grabbed my rifle and backed away as far as I could without leaving the cabin. Palmer, I shouted over his screams, what's happening to you? His body twisted unnaturally, his limbs elongating in ways that shouldn't have been possible. His jaw dislocated with a sickening crack, stretching wider than any human mouth should be able to go. His skin grew pale and tight against his bones, making him look like a walking skeleton, and then he stopped moving. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, except for the sound of the wind outside. I held my breath, gripping my rifle so tightly my knuckles turned white. Then he opened his eyes. They weren't human anymore, glowing faintly in the dim light of the cabin like two burning coals. He let out a low growl that sent chills down my spine before lunging at me with impossible speed. I fired my rifle without thinking. The shot hit him square in the chest, but it didn't even slow him down. He was on me in seconds, his elongated fingers clawing at my jacket as I struggled to push him off. Somehow, I managed to shove him back long enough to grab an iron poker from beside the wood stove. I swung it as hard as I could, connecting with his head and sending him crashing into the wall. But even that wasn't enough to stop him. He got back up almost instantly, snarling like a wild animal as he charged at me again. This time, I didn't wait for him to get close. I grabbed my coat and bolted out the door into the blizzard. The cold hit me like a wall of knives, cutting through every layer of clothing I had on. The snow was so thick I could barely see more than a few feet ahead of me, but I didn't care. All I knew was that I had to get away from that thing, whatever it was. I ran blindly through the storm, stumbling over tree roots and sinking into drifts of snow up to my knees. Behind me, I could hear it following, its footsteps crunching loudly against the frozen ground despite the howling wind. It wasn't just following me, it was hurting me. I realized too late where it was leading me, out onto Blackwater Lake. The ice groaned under my weight as I stepped onto it, but there was nowhere else to go. The creature emerged from the trees. Moments later, its glowing eyes cutting through the darkness like twin lanterns. It moved slowly now, almost deliberately, like it knew there was no escape for me here. But what it didn't know was that I had a plan. Earlier that winter, I'd mapped out thermal springs beneath Blackwater Lake where the ice was thinner than anywhere else. If I could lure it onto one of those weak spots, come on. I shouted into the storm, trying to keep my voice steady despite my fear. Is this all you've got? The creature let out an ear-piercing screech before charging at me again. I waited until it was almost on top of me before diving out of its path at the last second. Its momentum carried it forward onto the weak ice, and just as I'd hoped, it gave way beneath its weight with a loud crack. The Wendigo plunged into the freezing water below with one final scream that echoed across the lake. But as it sank beneath the surface, one of its elongated hands shot out and grabbed my leg, pulling me toward the hole in the ice. Desperate, I reached for my hunting knife and did what had to be done. I cut through my own boot and flesh until its grip loosened enough for me to pull free. The pain was blinding as blood poured from what remained of my foot onto the ice. Somehow, I managed to crawl back toward shore before collapsing in exhaustion. I don't know how I survived that night. By the time the search party found me, I was lying in the snow halfway to my cabin, barely conscious. My hands were frostbitten, my face burned from the cold, and my leg, well, I don't like to think about it. The blood trail I left behind must have been what led them to me. They said I was lucky to be alive, but I didn't feel lucky. Not then, not now. The rescue team searched the lake for bodies, Palmer's, the other researchers, anything that could explain what had happened, but they didn't find a thing. No footprints, no signs of struggle, not even a broken piece of ice where the creature had gone under. It was as if everything had been wiped clean by the storm. They offered me a prosthetic foot after the doctors amputated what was left of mine, but I refused. The thought of having something artificial attached to me made my skin crawl. It would give it something to hold on to next time. I told them, though they didn't understand what I meant. I was transferred to an administrative position after that desk work far away from the Boundary Waters. They said it was for my own good, that I needed time to recover both physically and mentally. But every winter, when the temperatures dropped below freezing and the snow began to fall, I felt the pull to go back. Eventually, I requested to be reassigned to my old station. They thought I was crazy, but they approved it anyway. Maybe they figured I'd earned the right to make my own decisions after everything I'd been through. Now, every winter, I sit in my cabin with a map spread out on the table in front of me. It's marked with red dots, places where people have gone missing in conditions just like those researchers did. Some of those dots date back over a century. Others are more recent. I don't know what it is about this land that draws the Wendigo here, or if it's even the same creature every time, but I know it's still out there, waiting. Sometimes, when the temperature drops below -50 degrees Fahrenheit and the wind howls through the trees at night, I hear voices calling my name again. They sound distant at first, but then they grow louder, clearer, like someone standing just outside my door. I don't answer them anymore. My name is Catherine Sullivan, but most people call me Kate. I'm 35 years old, and I've spent nearly half my life as a search and rescue ranger in the Cascade Mountains of Washington. If there's one thing I'm known for, it's that I've never lost a missing person case, not once. People say I have a gift for tracking, like I can see things others can't. But if you ask me, it's just years of experience and knowing these mountains like the back of my hand. Still, there's one place up here that even I don't like, Dead Echo Ridge. The name alone gives you chills, doesn't it? It's this stretch of wilderness where compasses go haywire, radios cut out, and the forest feels wrong. Officially, they say it's because of magnetic anomalies in the ground. But deep down, I've always felt there's more to it than that. It was late October 1985, right before the first snow of the season. I was leading a group of junior rangers on a routine training exercise through a remote part of the Cascades. The air was crisp, the leaves were fiery shades of red and orange, and the forest smelled like pine and damp earth. It should have been peaceful, beautiful even, but something felt off that day. We set up camp near Dead Echo Ridge just before sunset. Around the fire, we joked and shared stories like we always did. Michael Peterson, one of the younger rangers, asked me about the ridge. "Is it true compasses don't work there?" he said with a nervous grin. "They don't," I replied casually, poking at the fire with a stick. "But don't worry, it's just science." That was a lie. I didn't want to scare them with my gut feelings or the strange stories I'd heard over the years. As night fell, the forest grew unnaturally quiet. No birds, no crickets, nothing but the crackling fire and our own voices. It was subtle at first, but then it hit me. Something wasn't right. The woods were too still, too empty. I stayed up late that night while everyone else slept in their tents. Sitting by the fire, I kept scanning the tree line with my flashlight, feeling like we were being watched. But every time I shone the light into the trees, there was nothing there, just shadows and swaying branches in the wind. The next morning came without incident, but that uneasy feeling stayed with me as we packed up camp and prepared to move deeper into the wilderness for more training drills. The morning air was colder than I expected, and the forest was still eerily quiet. Normally, you'd hear birds chirping or squirrels rustling in the leaves, but there was nothing, just the sound of our boots crunching on the trail. We headed toward Dead Echo Ridge for the next part of the training exercise. The junior rangers were excited, chatting about how they'd handle different survival scenarios, but I couldn't shake that uneasy feeling from the night before. About an hour into the hike, Michael called out, Kate, you gotta see this." He was crouched near a patch of dirt just off the trail. I walked over and saw what he was pointing at. Heek. At first glance, they looked like wolf tracks, but something about them was off. The spacing between them didn't make sense, like whatever made them had been walking on 2 legs instead of 4. And then there was the weirdest part, the tracks just stopped. No sign of where the animal went, no scuffed dirt or broken branches. It was like it had vanished into thin air. "That's strange," I said, trying to keep my voice steady for the group's sake. Could be an injured animal dragging itself. But I didn't believe that for a second. We kept moving, but I noticed Michael kept glancing over his shoulder like he expected something to jump out at him. I didn't blame him. I felt it too. Later that afternoon, we came across something even stranger, a cluster of broken branches arranged in neat geometric patterns on the ground. It looked deliberate, like someone or something had placed them there on purpose. "Is this some kind of prank?" James Rivera, my second in command, asked as he knelt to examine them. "No," I said firmly. "It's not. My gut told me these weren't random. They meant something, but I didn't know what yet." By the time we reached Dead Echo Ridge, the sun was starting to dip below the horizon again. We stopped to set up camp for the night and checked our radios to make sure we could stay in contact if anyone wandered too far during patrols. That's when things got really weird. "Testing radio check," James said into his walkie-talkie. "Testing radio check," his voice repeated back, but not from his radio. It came from somewhere deep in the woods. Everyone froze. "What was that?" Michael whispered. "What was that?" Michael whispered. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the trees again, but all I saw were shadows stretching long and dark against the fading light. "It's probably just an echo," I said quickly, though I knew echoes didn't behave like that. As night settled in, Michael volunteered to do a quick patrol around camp to make sure everything was secure. He grabbed his flashlight and headed out while we stayed by the fire. 15 minutes passed, then 20, then 30. Michael should have been back by now, James said nervously. I stood up and grabbed my gear. Stay here, I told the others firmly. I'll go find him. I followed the trail Michael had taken earlier, calling his name every few minutes as I walked deeper into the woods. Michael, I shouted again. Kate, a voice called back, but it wasn't coming from where I expected. It sounded like him, but it echoed strangely, bouncing around in a way that made it impossible to tell where it came from. I froze in place as goosebumps ran down my arms. Michael, I called hesitantly. Kate, his voice repeated, but this time it sounded closer, and farther away at the same time. I turned toward where I thought his voice was coming from and shone my flashlight through the trees, and that's when I saw it, his radio lying on the ground with no sign of him anywhere nearby. I picked up the radio and clicked it on to call back to camp, but before I could say anything, Michael's voice crackled through it. Help me, Kate, help me. His voice sounded distorted and wrong, like someone trying to mimic him but not quite getting it right. That's when I realized we weren't alone out here anymore. I stood there in the dark, clutching Michael's radio, my heart pounding so loud I could hear it in my ears. The forest around me felt alive, like it was breathing, watching. I forced myself to take a deep breath and think. Michael, I said into the radio, trying to keep my voice steady. If you can hear me, stay where you are. I'm coming to get you. No response, just static. I turned back toward camp, shining my flashlight in wide arcs as I walked. Every shadow felt like it was moving, and every sound, branches snapping, leaves rustling, made me jump. When I got back to the others, their faces were pale with worry. Did you find him? James asked immediately. I shook my head. Just his radio, I said, holding it up. We'll search for him at first light. But what if one of the younger rangers started to say, but I cut him off? No, what ifs, I said firmly. We stick together and stay calm. That night, none of us slept much. We took turns keeping watch by the fire, but every so often, we'd hear strange noises coming from the woods, branches snapping, whispers that sounded almost human but not quite right. Around midnight, James nudged me awake during his shift. Kate, he whispered, his voice trembling. You need to see this. I followed him to the edge of camp, where he pointed to something on the ground. More tracks. But these weren't like the ones we'd seen earlier. They were bigger, deeper, and they circled our camp like someone or something had been walking around us while we slept. Stay close to the fire, I told everyone when we got back to camp. Whatever's out there doesn't like light. The next morning, we started searching for Michael as soon as the sun came up. We spread out into small groups, but stayed within shouting distance of each other. The forest felt even more oppressive in the daylight, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. After about an hour of searching, one of the rangers called out, "Over here." We all ran toward his voice and found him standing by a tree with a look of pure horror on his face. He pointed up into the branches without saying a word. Hanging from one of the branches was Michael's backpack, and underneath it, nailed to the tree trunk with a jagged piece of wood, was his severed hand. The group erupted into panic, some shouting, some crying, but I forced myself to stay calm. "Listen to me," I shouted over them. "We don't know what did this or why, but if we lose our heads now, we're dead too." James stepped forward and put a hand on my shoulder. "What do we do?" he asked quietly. "We head back," I said firmly. "We regroup at base camp and call for backup." But deep down, I knew backup wouldn't help, not against whatever this was. As we started making our way back toward camp, things got worse. The forest seemed to shift around us. Trails that should have been familiar suddenly led nowhere or looped back on themselves. And then there were the voices. "Help me." Michael's voice called from somewhere ahead. "Over here." Another voice shouted. It sounded like James this time. But James was right next to me. "They're messing with us," I whispered under my breath. "What?" James asked. "Nothing," I said quickly. By the time we made it back to camp, everyone was on edge, and that's when we found it. Our tents had been ripped apart like paper, and all our supplies were gone or destroyed. "We can't stay here," one of the rangers said shakily. "No," I agreed. "We'll head for Dead Echo Ridge. It's higher ground and easier to defend." As we packed up what little gear we had left and started moving again, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being herded, like sheep toward a slaughterhouse. And then it hit me. That's why this wasn't random. Whatever was out here wasn't just hunting us, it was learning from us. By the time we reached Dead Echo Ridge, the sun was dipping low again, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The wind had picked up, carrying with it the faint smell of rain and something else, something metallic and sharp that made my stomach twist. The ridge was a rocky outcrop surrounded by dense trees with a steep drop on one side. It wasn't ideal, but it was defensible. We set up what little gear we had left and tried to make a plan. "We need to keep moving," James said, pacing back and forth. "If we stay here, we're sitting ducks. And go where?" I snapped, more harshly than I intended. "We're cut off from base camp, we have no supplies, and whatever's out there knows this terrain better than we do." James stopped pacing and looked at me, his jaw tight. "So what do we do, Kate? Just wait for them to pick us off one by one?" I didn't have an answer. As night fell, the storm hit. Lightning lit up the sky in flashes, and thunder rumbled through the mountains like some ancient beast waking up. The rain came down in sheets, soaking us to the bone and making it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. But even through the storm, we could hear them. The mimics. At first, it was just whispers, soft and low, like someone trying to talk without being heard. Then came the voices. "Heat, help me. Heat, heat. Over here." They were everywhere, calling from the trees, from the rocks, from the shadows, and they weren't just using Michael's voice anymore. They were using ours. I heard my own voice calling out from somewhere in the darkness. "This way. Hurry." One of the younger rangers panicked and bolted into the woods before I could stop him. "Wait." I shouted after him, but it was too late. His screams echoed back to us a moment later, high-pitched and cut short like someone had flipped a switch. "We can't stay here," James said again, his voice shaking now. "No," I agreed quietly. "We can't." Just then, there was a loud crash behind us, a tree falling or being pushed over, and we all spun around to see something moving in the shadows. It was fast, too fast to get a good look at, but I caught a glimpse of its shape as lightning lit up the sky. Tall and hunched over like a wolf standing on two legs, with long arms that hung almost to the ground. Its eyes glowed faintly in the dark, reflecting the light like an animal's, but there was something disturbingly human about them too. "They're testing us," I said aloud without thinking. "What?" James asked. "They're not just hunting us, they're figuring us out," I said slowly, piecing it together as I spoke. "They're learning how we think, how we move. They're getting smarter." The group fell silent as that sunk in. "We need to draw them out," I said finally. "Force them into the open where we can see them." "And how do we do that?" James asked skeptically. I thought for a moment before an idea came to me. "Risky, but our best shot. We'll use fire," I said simply. We gathered whatever dry wood we could find under the rocky overhangs and built several small fires. Around our position, the flames cast flickering light across the ridge, pushing back the shadows and hopefully whatever was hiding in them. For a while it seemed to work. The voices faded into silence, and we started to believe maybe they'd backed off. But then, they came. It started with movement at the edge of the firelight. Quick flashes of shapes darting between trees too fast to track. Then one of them stepped into view. A mimic. It looked almost human at first glance. Tall and gaunt with long limbs, but its face was wrong. Its features shifted constantly like it couldn't decide what it wanted to look like. And then it opened its mouth and my voice came out. "It's okay. You're safe now." Another stepped forward beside it, and another, until there were at least half a dozen of them circling us just outside the firelight. "They're waiting for the fire to die down," James whispered beside me. "Not if I can help it," I muttered under my breath. Grabbing a burning branch from one of the fire, I stepped forward and swung it toward them like a weapon. They hissed and backed away but didn't retreat completely. They were testing me too now. Suddenly, one of them lunged forward faster than I could react, but James tackled me out of the way just in time. The creature skidded into the fire behind me with an ear-piercing screech before scrambling back into the shadows. "They can be hurt," James said breathlessly as he helped me up. "But not easily," I replied grimly. We fought them off as best we could through sheer determination and desperation, using fire and whatever makeshift weapons we had left. But they kept coming, relentless and unyielding, like they knew time was on their side. And then, I saw it. My sister's backpack lying among their grotesque collection of trophies near their nesting ground. A cruel reminder of why I'd never truly left these mountains behind all those years ago. I wanted so badly to go after it, to find out what had happened to her. But there wasn't time, not if any of us were going to survive this night alive. The storm raged on as if the sky itself was trying to warn us. But it was the least of our problems. The mimics were closing in. Their movements were faster now, more coordinated. They weren't just testing us anymore, they were attacking. We had barricaded ourselves inside an old fire lookout we'd stumbled across near the edge of Dead Echo Ridge. It was a small wooden structure, barely holding together after years of neglect, but it was better than nothing. The door was reinforced with planks we'd ripped from the floorboards, and we'd lit torches to keep the creatures at bay. But they were smart, too smart. They stayed just out of reach, circling like sharks, their glowing eyes flickering in the dark. Every so often, one of them would mimic a voice, sometimes Michael's, sometimes mine, sometimes someone else's entirely. "Let me in." A voice cried from outside. It sounded like James. But James was standing right next to me, gripping a broken chair leg like a club. "They're trying to mess with us," he said through gritted teeth. "It's working," I muttered under my breath. I could feel the group unraveling. One of the younger rangers, Sarah, was sitting in the corner, rocking back and forth with her hands over her ears. Another, Tom, kept pacing back and forth, muttering to himself about how none of this could be real. "We can't stay here," James said again, his voice low but urgent. "I know," I replied quietly. "But if we leave now, they'll pick us off before we make it 10 feet. "What's the plan then?" he asked. I didn't have one, not yet. My mind was racing, trying to piece together everything I knew about these creatures. They mimicked voices and sounds to lure their prey. They avoided fire but weren't completely afraid of it, and they were learning, adapting with every encounter. Then it hit me. If they were learning from us, maybe I could use that against them. "Listen up," I said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "We're going to make a run for it, but not all at once." "What?" Sarah looked up at me with wide, tear-streaked eyes. "They're expecting us to panic and scatter," I explained. "But if we confuse them, make them think we're going one way when we're really going another, we might have a chance." "How do we do that?" Tom asked skeptically. "We use sound," I said simply. I pulled out my old tape recorder from my pack, a habit I'd picked up years ago for documenting search operations, and started recording our voices, shouting commands, calling for help, anything that might throw the mimics off. Then I set the recorder on a timer and placed it near one of the windows facing away from where we planned to escape. "When this goes off," I said, "they'll think we're heading that way." "And what if they don't fall for it?" James asked. "Then we improvise," I said grimly. The timer ticked down as we prepared to make our move. Everyone grabbed what little they had left, makeshift weapons, flashlights, anything that might help us survive, and waited by the door. When the recorder finally clicked on and started playing our voices at full volume, the reaction was immediate. The mimics outside screeched in unison, a horrible sound that made my skin crawl, and bolted toward the source of the noise. "Now," I shouted. We threw open the door and ran into the storm. Lightning lit up the forest in brief flashes, revealing glimpses of movement all around us, shadows darting between trunks, glowing eyes watching from above. "Stick together," I yelled over the wind and thunder. "Don't stop." But no matter how fast we ran or how carefully we planned our route, they were always there, just behind us or just ahead, cutting us off at every turn. It wasn't long before they started picking us off. The first to go was Tom. So one moment he was running beside me, the next he was gone, dragged screaming into the darkness by something too fast to see. Then Sarah tripped over a root and fell hard onto her hands and knees. Before I could reach her, one of them lunged out of the shadows and grabbed her by the ankle, dragging her away as she screamed my name. "Keep moving," James shouted as he pulled me forward. By the time we reached an open clearing near a steep drop-off overlooking Dead Echo Ridge, there were only 3 of us left. Me, James, and one other ranger whose name I couldn't even remember. In that moment, I was too focused on staying alive. The mimics closed in around us again, their glowing eyes flickering like fireflies in the dark. There were more of them now, dozens at least, and they weren't waiting anymore. "This is it," James said quietly as he stood beside me. "We're not getting out of this." "Yes, we are," I said firmly, even though I wasn't sure if I believed it myself. I pulled out my last resort, a flare gun I'd been saving for emergencies. It wasn't much, but it was all we had left. As one of the creatures lunged toward us with its shifting face and 2 long limbs, I fired straight into its chest. The flare exploded on impact in a burst of light and heat that sent it screeching back into the shadows, but not before setting some nearby brush on fire. That's when I got an idea. A crazy idea that might just work. "We're lighting it up," I said to James as I grabbed a burning branch from the growing flames and started swinging it wildly at anything that moved. "What are you talking about?" he asked incredulously. "If they want this forest so bad," I said through gritted teeth, "we'll burn it down around them." Using what little fuel we had left, along with dry branches and leaves, we started spreading the fire as quickly as possible while keeping the creatures at bay with torches and flares. The flames spread fast in spite of the rain, licking up trees and bushes until they formed a wall of fire between us and the mimics. For now, we were safe. But as I looked back toward their nesting ground one last time before retreating into what remained of the forest, my heart sank. Among their grotesque collection of trophies, the bones and belongings of their countless victims, I saw something that stopped me cold: my sister's backpack. I wanted so badly to go back to find out what had happened to her, but there wasn't time, not if any of us were going to survive this night alive. By the time we made it back to the ranger station, the first light of dawn was breaking over the mountains. The fire we'd started had spread through the forest, creating a thick haze of smoke that clung to the air. It wasn't enough to stop them forever. I knew that. But it had bought us time. James and I were the only ones who made it out. The others, they were gone. Their faces haunted me as I stood in the station, staring blankly at the radio while James called for help. When the rescue team arrived later that morning, they didn't believe us, not really. They chalked it all up to a mountain lion attack and mass hysteria brought on by stress and exhaustion. They said the fire was an accident, caused by lightning from the storm. But I knew better. As I sat there in the station, wrapped in a blanket and sipping lukewarm coffee, I started piecing it all together. The tracks, the voices, the patterns, they weren't random. The mimics had been here for a long time, maybe even longer than we could imagine. And this wasn't the first time they'd hunted people in these mountains. It was just the first time anyone had survived to tell about it. Over the next few weeks, I couldn't shake what had happened. I started digging through old records, missing person reports, strange sightings, unexplained deaths, and found a disturbing pattern. Every 12 years, like clockwork, people disappeared around Dead Echo Ridge. Families, hikers, hunters, gone without a trace. I also started preparing. I trained search dogs to pick up on scents that didn't belong, scents like the strange biological material we'd found after wounding one of them. I installed motion sensors and cameras throughout the region, hoping to catch even a glimpse of them before they struck again. But most of all, I waited. 12 years later, on another blood moon night, I found myself standing at Dead Echo Ridge once more. This time, I wasn't unprepared. I had weapons, traps, and years of knowledge about how they hunted. As the wind picked up and the forest fell silent again, I heard it, my own voice calling from the darkness. "Kate, over here." I didn't run this time. I was ready. My name is Richard Thompson, but most folks just call me Frost. I'm a winter ranger stationed in Denali National Park, Alaska. It's the kind of job that most people would never want, isolated, freezing, and dark. But for me, it's home. I've been doing this for over 20 years, and if there's one thing I've learned, it's that the wilderness has a way of humbling you. Out here, you don't fight nature, you respect it. It was the winter of 1991, and I had taken up my usual post at one of the most remote monitoring stations in the park. This place was a small cabin surrounded by endless snow and silence. No roads, no neighbors, just me and the long Alaskan night. For 56 days straight, the sun wouldn't rise. The only light came from the stars and the aurora borealis dancing across the sky. My routine was simple. Every morning, or what passed for morning, I'd bundle up in layers, step outside into the biting cold, and check my weather instruments. I'd log temperatures, wind speeds, and anything unusual in my journal. I've kept these journals for decades now, a habit passed down from my grandfather, who taught me to pay attention to every detail in nature. That winter started off like any other. The radio check-ins with headquarters were on schedule every 48 hours. The wildlife seemed to be preparing for the deep freeze ahead, caribou heading south, wolves sticking close to their packs. But then something strange caught my eye. Animals were moving in the wrong direction. Instead of heading south to escape the cold, they were going north, straight into harsher conditions. At first, I thought it was just a fluke. The aurora borealis that year was brighter than I'd ever seen before. The greens and blues lit up the sky like a living painting, but there was something off about it. The patterns weren't random like they usually were. They looked almost geometric, lines and shapes that didn't belong in nature. I brushed it off as tiredness, or maybe just my imagination playing tricks on me. After all, being alone out here can mess with your head if you're not careful. But then came the first real sign that something wasn't right. During one of my radio check-ins with headquarters, I noticed an odd echo in the transmission. I'd say something like temperature holding steady at -20, and then I'd hear my own voice repeating those exact words a second later, but distorted, like it wasn't quite human anymore. I tried not to think too much about it. Maybe it was just interference from solar flares. Those can mess with radio signals sometimes. But deep down, I felt a knot forming in my stomach, a quiet warning that something bigger was coming. One night, as I sat by the wood stove writing in my journal, I noticed something strange: gaps in my entries. Whole hours were missing. Times when I couldn't remember what I'd been doing or where I'd been. My hands started shaking as I flipped through the pages, seeing more and more blank spots where there should have been notes. And then there was the caribou carcass. I found it about half a mile from the station during one of my routine patrols. At first glance, it looked untouched. No signs of predators or scavengers. But when I got closer and touched it with my gloved hand, it felt wrong. The body wasn't frozen solid like you'd expect in this weather. It was flash frozen, drained of all its warmth, as if something had sucked the heat right out of it. That night, as I stared out at the aurora through the frost-covered window, an old story my grandfather used to tell me came back to me. Tales of sky thieves. He said they were spirits that came with the northern lights to steal warmth and life from anyone who wandered too far into their domain. I shook my head and laughed nervously to myself. "Get a grip, Frost," I muttered under my breath. "It's just an old story." But deep down, I wasn't so sure anymore. The days or nights really started blending together. Out here, time doesn't feel the same when the sun never rises. But lately, I'd been noticing things that didn't make sense. Little things at first, like the radio echo I mentioned earlier. But then it got worse. One evening, I was sitting at the desk in the cabin, logging the day's weather readings. The temperature had dropped to -40, which wasn't unusual for this time of year. But then the sensor outside recorded something impossible, -120 degrees for a split second before bouncing back to normal. I stared at the numbers on the screen, thinking it had to be a glitch. Equipment fails all the time in extreme cold, right? But still, -120. That's not just cold, it's deadly. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside to check the sensor. The air felt colder than usual, biting through my heavy coat like needles. As I walked toward the weather station a few yards away, I noticed how quiet it was. Too quiet. Normally you'd hear the wind or maybe the distant howl of a wolf pack. But tonight, nothing. When I reached the sensor, everything looked fine. No damage, no signs of malfunction. But as I turned to head back inside, something caught my eye at the edge of the tree line, a shadow, or maybe a figure. It was tall and thin, so thin it didn't look natural. I froze in place, gripping my flashlight tighter. The beam didn't reach far enough to show what it was, but I could feel it watching me. I blinked, and it was gone. I hurried back inside and locked the door behind me. My heart was pounding as I leaned against the wall, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. "You're tired," I whispered to myself. "You're seeing things," but deep down I knew better. The next few days brought more strange occurrences. One morning, I woke up feeling disoriented, like I'd been asleep for days instead of hours. When I checked my journal entries from the night before, they didn't make sense. There were gaps where I should have written something but hadn't. And worse, some of the entries weren't in my handwriting. Then there were the animals, or what was left of them. Every time I ventured out for patrols, I'd find another carcass frozen solid in the snow. A fox curled up as if sleeping but completely lifeless. A raven perched on a branch with its wings outstretched like it had been flash-frozen mid-flight. None of them showed any signs of attack or illness. They were just empty. I started thinking about those old stories again, the ones my grandfather used to tell me about spirits that came with the northern lights. He called them aurora walkers. According to him, they weren't spirits in the way most people think. They were something else entirely. Something ancient and hungry. I didn't want to believe it, not yet. But every instinct in my body told me something unnatural was happening here. One night, as I sat by the wood stove trying to warm up after another patrol, the radio crackled to life on its own. Normally, headquarters only called during scheduled check-ins every 48 hours. But this wasn't them. It couldn't be. The voice on the other end sounded like mine, but distorted and wrong. "Richard Thompson," it hissed through static. "Come outside." I stared at the radio in disbelief, my hands trembling as chills ran down my spine. "No," I whispered under my breath. The voice repeated itself, calm but insistent. "Come outside." I turned off the radio and backed away slowly until my legs hit the edge of my cot. My heart was racing now, and every nerve in my body screamed at me not to open that door, not tonight. Instead, I grabbed my journal and started flipping through pages frantically, searching for answers, or maybe just reassurance that I wasn't losing my mind. That's when I found something strange tucked between two pages, a folded piece of paper that wasn't mine. It was old and yellowed with age, written in shaky handwriting, "Doost, doost, they come with the lights." The folded paper with the words "Doost, they come with the lights," stuck in my mind like a splinter. Who had left it here? Was it from the ranger who had this post before me? I didn't know, but the thought of someone else experiencing what I was going through made my skin crawl. The next day or night, I couldn't tell anymore. I heard a knock at the door. A knock out here? That was impossible. No one just shows up in the middle of nowhere, especially during the winter season. My first thought was that maybe headquarters had sent someone to check on me, but they would have radioed first. I grabbed my rifle and cautiously opened the door. Standing there, shivering and covered in frost, was a woman. She looked exhausted, her face pale and her breath coming out in shaky clouds. "Please, let me in," she said weakly. I stepped aside and helped her inside, closing the door quickly behind her to keep the cold out. She introduced herself as Dr. Eliza Morgan, a research scientist studying aurora activity in the area. Her equipment had failed during a storm, and she'd been wandering through the snow for hours trying to find shelter. I offered her some hot coffee and a blanket while she warmed up by the wood stove. As she sipped from the mug, she looked at me with an intensity that made me uneasy. "You've seen them, haven't you?" she asked. I froze. "Seen what?" She leaned forward, lowering her voice like she didn't want anyone or anything to overhear. The figures, the ones that come with the lights. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I stared into my coffee mug, trying to decide if I could trust her. Finally, I nodded. I've seen something, I admitted, but I don't know what they are. Eliza's face darkened. They're not from here, she said quietly. Not from this world. She went on to explain that she'd been studying temporal anomalies linked to aurora borealis activity for years. Her research had uncovered patterns, times when reality itself seemed to bend near strong auroras. People reported missing time, strange visions, and even encounters with beings they couldn't explain. They feed on life energy, she said. Not your body, your essence. That's why those animals you found were frozen solid but untouched. Her words made my stomach turn. Everything I'd been experiencing suddenly felt more real and more dangerous. Later that night, as Eliza set up what was left of her equipment to monitor the aurora outside, I decided to look through some old storage boxes in the cabin. If someone had left that note about the lights, maybe there was more they'd written down. In one box, I found a journal dated 1958, the year this station was first built. The handwriting was different from mine, but eerily familiar, shaky and desperate. The entries described events almost identical to what I was experiencing now: radio echoes, missing time, impossible cold temperatures, and figures lurking just out of sight. One entry sent chills down my spine. Time, they don't like light reflected through ice. Asterisk, asterisk. I showed Eliza the journal, and she immediately started piecing things together with her research. She explained that ice crystals can refract light in unique ways that might disrupt whatever connection these entities have to our world. But before we could test anything, something happened that neither of us expected. The radio crackled again, but this time it wasn't distorted or echoing my voice. It was a man's voice calling for help. Mayday, Mayday. This is Pilot Mark Reynolds. Helicopter down. Request immediate assistance. Eliza and I exchanged a look of panic before grabbing our gear and heading out into the storm to find him. We followed his distress signal for nearly an hour through blinding snow and biting winds until we finally found his crashed helicopter half buried in snowdrifts. The pilot was slumped against the wreckage, barely conscious but alive. As we helped him back to his feet, he muttered something that made my blood run cold. They touched me. I looked at him closely under the beam of my flashlight and saw what he meant. His skin looked aged, wrinkled, like he'd lived decades longer than he should have in just a few hours. We need to get back to the station, Eliza said urgently. Now. We barely made it back to the station. The wind howled like a living thing, and the snow fell so thick it felt like walking through a wall. Eliza and I half carried the pilot, Mark, who was fading fast. His skin looked worse with every step, paler, thinner, like the life was being drained out of him. When we finally got inside, I bolted the door and turned up the wood stove as high as it would go. Eliza wrapped Mark in every blanket we had, but he still shivered violently. His breath came in shallow gasps, and his eyes darted around the room like he was seeing something we couldn't. They're here, he whispered hoarsely. They're watching. I didn't know what to say. I wanted to tell him he was safe now, but deep down I wasn't sure that was true. Eliza didn't waste any time. She grabbed her equipment and started taking readings near the windows. The aurora is peaking, she said, her voice tense. It's stronger than anything I've ever seen before. I glanced outside and felt my chest tighten. The lights in the sky were brighter than ever, vivid greens and blues twisting into impossible shapes. It was beautiful and terrifying. Then I saw them. At first they were just shadows at the edge of the clearing, tall, impossibly thin figures that seemed to flicker in and out of existence. But as the aurora grew brighter, they became clearer. Their bodies were dark and featureless, like silhouettes cut out of reality itself. They didn't move like people. They glided, almost as if they weren't touching the ground. Eliza, I said quietly, not taking my eyes off them. They're here. She joined me at the window and froze. We need to act now, she said firmly. If we don't stop them before they fully manifest, we won't survive this. Her words sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. The power went out an hour later. One moment, the lights in the cabin were flickering. The next, we were plunged into total darkness. The only light came from the faint glow of the aurora outside filtering through the frosted windows. "Eliza," I called out, fumbling for my flashlight. "Here," she answered from across the room. Her voice was steady but strained. The backup generator should kick in soon, but it didn't. Instead, the temperature inside the cabin started dropping fast. My breath turned to mist in front of me, and frost began creeping across the walls like something alive. Mark let out a weak cry from his spot by the wood stove. "They're inside," he whispered. I turned toward him and froze. One of them was standing in the corner of the room. It didn't make a sound or move toward us. It just stood there, impossibly tall and thin, its head tilted slightly, as if it were studying us. The air around it seemed darker somehow, like it was sucking all the light out of the room. "Eliza," I shouted, backing away from it. "What do we do?" She grabbed her journal and flipped through it frantically until she found what she was looking for. "Ice," she said suddenly. "We need ice." "What? Why?" "They can't handle light refracted through ice," she explained hurriedly. "It disrupts their connection to this dimension." I didn't have time to question her. I ran outside into the storm and grabbed chunks of ice from a nearby snowdrift, my hands freezing even through my gloves. When I got back inside, Eliza had already set up one of her portable lights on a tripod. "Place it here," she instructed urgently, pointing to a spot in front of the light. I did as she said, arranging the ice so that it caught and scattered the light in all directions. As soon as we turned on the lamp, something incredible happened. The figure in the corner let out a low, guttural sound that made my ears ring before vanishing into thin air. "It worked," Eliza said breathlessly. "But they'll be back." For hours, we fought to keep them at bay. Every time one of them appeared inside or near the cabin, we used our makeshift light traps to force them back into hiding. But they were relentless and smart. They started targeting Eliza's equipment first, smashing anything that could help us fight back. Mark didn't make it through the night. Whatever those things had done to him finally caught up with him. He let out one last shaky breath and went still, his face frozen in an expression of pure terror. Eliza wiped tears from her eyes but kept working tirelessly to refine our defenses. "We can't keep this up forever," she said grimly. "We need a way to send them back for good." That's when I remembered something from my grandfather's stories. "Said it. They fear fire from above." "Eliza," I said slowly, an idea forming in my mind. "What if we use a solar flare?" She stared at me for a moment, before nodding slowly. "It could work, if we can amplify its energy through your weather array." It was a long shot, but it was all we had left. The plan was risky, but it was our only chance. The weather array outside the station had a series of satellite dishes used to monitor atmospheric conditions. If we could angle them just right, they might reflect and amplify the energy from the aurora and the incoming solar flare. It wasn't a perfect solution, but Eliza believed it could disrupt the entities enough to send them back to wherever they came from. We didn't have much time. The aurora was at its peak, and the walkers were becoming bolder. Every few minutes, one of them would appear inside the cabin, forcing us to use our ice traps to drive it away. Each time it felt like they were getting closer, lingering longer. "Eliza," I said as I pulled on my thick coat and gloves, "if this doesn't work." She cut me off. "It will work," she said firmly, though her voice wavered just enough to betray her fear. I nodded and grabbed my flashlight and tools. Together we stepped out into the storm. The wind was brutal, whipping snow into our faces and making it nearly impossible to see. The aurora above us lit up the sky in eerie greens and blues, casting long shadows across the snow-covered ground. Those shadows moved in ways they shouldn't have, stretching and twisting as if alive. I tried not to look too closely. We reached the weather array, a towering structure with several large satellite dishes pointed at the sky. Eliza immediately got to work adjusting the angles while I kept watch. Every so often, I thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, tall, thin shapes gliding through the storm, but when I turned to look directly at them, there was nothing there. "Hurry," I urged her, my breath fogging up in the freezing air. "I'm going as fast as I can," she snapped back, her hands shaking as she adjusted one of the dishes. This kind of precision isn't easy in a blizzard. Suddenly, I felt it, a deep, bone-chilling cold that went far beyond anything natural. I turned around slowly and saw them. Dozens of Aurora walkers were standing at the edge of the clearing, their silhouettes barely visible against the swirling snow. They weren't flickering anymore. They were fully formed now, solid and terrifying. Their heads tilted in unison as if studying us. "Eliza," I said quietly. She looked up from her work and froze. "Oh no." The walkers began moving toward us, not walking but gliding across the snow like shadows cast by an unseen light. The air around them seemed to warp and darken, and with every step they took closer, the temperature dropped even further. "Eliza," I shouted, "we need to finish this now." She fumbled with the last adjustments on the dish before stepping back. "It's ready," she yelled over the wind, "but we need more time for the solar flare to hit." "We don't have more time," I shouted back. The first walker reached us before we could react. It reached out with one impossibly long arm, its fingers stretching like tendrils of smoke toward Eliza. She screamed as frost began forming on her skin where it touched her arm, her breath coming out in ragged gasps as if all the warmth was being drained from her body. Without thinking, I swung my flashlight at it. The beam passed through its body harmlessly, but when it hit a patch of ice on the ground behind it, something strange happened. The light refracted off the ice and struck the walker directly in its chest. The creature let out a horrible sound, a low, guttural wail that made my ears ring before dissolving into nothingness. "It works," Eliza shouted through chattering teeth. "The light works, but there were too many of them now, more than we could possibly fight off with just a flashlight and some ice traps." That's when Eliza made her decision. "Richard," she said suddenly, her voice steady despite everything happening around us, "you need to finish this." "What are you talking about?" I asked, panic rising in my chest. She handed me her notebook, the one filled with all her research, and gave me a sad smile. "I'll buy you time." Before I could stop her, she ran straight into the middle of the clearing, where most of the walkers were gathered. She held up one of her portable lights and turned it on full blast, scattering beams of refracted light in every direction. The walkers recoiled at first but quickly regrouped, surrounding her like predators circling their prey. "Eliza," I screamed. "Go," she shouted back at me. "Finish it." I wanted to run after her. I wanted to save her, but deep down I knew she was right. If we didn't stop them here and now, none of us would survive this night. I climbed up onto the weather array and aimed one of the satellite dishes directly at the brightest part of the aurora overhead. My hands shook as I adjusted its angle using Eliza's notes as a guide. Then it happened. The solar flare was Hero. The aurora above us exploded into a blinding cascade of colors brighter than anything I'd ever seen before. The energy surged through the satellite dish and reflected down into the clearing below like a concentrated beam of light. The walkers let out an ear-piercing wail as they dissolved one by one into nothingness, pulled back into whatever dimension they'd come from. When it was over, everything went silent. I climbed down from the array and stumbled back toward where Eliza had been standing, but she was gone. All that remained was her notebook lying open in the snow. The silence was deafening. The storm had stopped, and the aurora above had faded into faint streaks of green barely visible against the night sky. I stood there in the snow, clutching Eliza's notebook, my breath coming out in ragged gasps. The air was still freezing, but it felt normal again. The impossible cold was gone. I called out her name, "Eliza." My voice echoed into the emptiness, but there was no answer. I searched the clearing, hoping, praying that she'd somehow survived. But deep down, I knew the truth. She was gone. She'd sacrificed herself to give me the time I needed to stop them. My legs felt weak as I stumbled back toward the cabin. Everything felt surreal, like a dream I couldn't wake up from. When I reached the door and stepped inside, The warmth from the wood stove hit me like a wave, but it didn't bring any comfort. Mark's lifeless body was still there, his face frozen in that same expression of terror. I sat down at the desk and opened Eliza's notebook. Her handwriting filled every page, notes about aurora patterns, temporal anomalies, and theories about interdimensional entities. On one of the last pages, she'd scrawled something hastily, as if she knew her time was running out. The aurora is a bridge. They need it to cross over. Disrupt the bridge and they can't stay. She'd been right. The solar flare had disrupted their connection to our world and forced them back to wherever they came from. But at what cost? The rescue team arrived 2 days later. I'd managed to get the backup generator working long enough to send out a distress signal. When they found me, I must have looked like a ghost. My face pale, my eyes hollow from lack of sleep. They asked me what had happened, but I didn't know how to explain it in a way that wouldn't make me sound insane. I told them about the storm, about Mark's crash, and about Eliza's sacrifice to save us all. I left out the part about the Aurora Walkers and what we'd really been fighting against. Some things are better left unsaid. They took me back to headquarters for a full debriefing and medical evaluation. The doctors said I'd physically aged by at least 10 years in just a few days. They couldn't explain it, but I could feel it in my bones. Whatever those things were, they'd left their mark on me. Months passed before I returned to my home village on tribal lands. The elders welcomed me back with quiet understanding. They didn't ask questions but seemed to know that something had changed in me. I spent my days teaching younger rangers how to read the signs in nature, how to respect it and listen to its warnings. But I also taught them something else, how to recognize patterns in the aurora that didn't belong, how to spot geometric shapes in the lights that weren't natural. I built warning systems based on what Eliza had taught me. Simple devices using ice crystals and light traps to protect against anything that might try to come through again. One night, as I sat outside by a small fire watching the sky, I noticed something strange. The aurora was brighter than usual, its colors vivid and alive, but there was something else too. Shapes began forming within the light's lines and angles that didn't belong. My heart sank as I realized what it meant. A new solar maximum was approaching, the period when solar activity peaks and auroras become more intense than ever before. I took a deep breath and stood up, feeling every bit of my years weighing on me. It wasn't over. Not yet. As I turned to head back inside, I whispered softly into the cold night air, "I'll be ready." My name is Howard Mitchell. I'm a park ranger at Mammoth Cave National Park in Kentucky, and I've spent most of my life underground, exploring the endless tunnels and chambers hidden beneath the earth. Some people call me a speleologist, a cave expert, but to me it's just home. My family's roots run deep in these caves. My grandfather was a coal miner, and he used to tell me wild stories about strange things he saw underground. I never believed him back then, but now, I'm not so sure. This spring of 1968 was supposed to be my last expedition before retirement. After losing my son in Vietnam last year, I wasn't sure I had much left in me. But when the park asked me to lead a team to map some newly discovered passages after the spring flooding, I couldn't say no. It felt like one last chance to do what I loved, and maybe to prove my grandfather wasn't as crazy as everyone thought. I packed his old journal with me. It's filled with sketches and notes about bizarre encounters he claimed to have had underground, things that don't make sense. Ageless creatures, strange sounds, tunnels that seemed alive. I've never seen anything like that myself, but part of me has always wondered if there was some truth to it. My team consisted of 2 experts, Dr. Rebecca Hayes, a geologist who could tell you the history of a rock just by looking at it, and James Wilson, a photographer from National Geographic who was there to document our findings. They were younger than me, smart, eager, full of energy, and I liked showing them the ropes. There's something magical about seeing someone experience the beauty of these caves for the first time. We set up camp in a massive chamber with towering limestone formations that looked like frozen waterfalls. The air was cool and damp, carrying that earthy smell I'd grown so used to over the years. Rebecca was already collecting samples from the walls, while James fiddled with his camera equipment, trying to capture the perfect shot. "This place is incredible," James said as he adjusted his lens. "It feels like another world down here." "It is another world," I replied with a smile. "And we've barely scratched the surface." As we settled in for the night, I felt that familiar sense of peace wash over me, the kind you only get deep underground, where time seems to stop and the outside world feels miles away. But there was something else too, a faint unease I couldn't quite put my finger on. Maybe it was just my nerves about retiring or my memories of my grandfather's stories creeping back into my mind. I shook it off and focused on what lay ahead. Tomorrow we'd start mapping the new passages and uncovering secrets hidden for centuries. Little did I know, those secrets were waiting for us and they weren't going to let us leave. The next morning, we packed up our gear and headed deeper into the cave. The air felt colder as we moved away from the main chamber, and the darkness seemed thicker somehow, pressing in on us like a heavy blanket. Our headlamps cut through it, but only just. I've been in hundreds of caves, but this one, it felt different. Rebecca was leading the way, her hammer and sample bag clinking as she walked. "Look at these formations," she said, shining her light on the walls. "The mineral deposits here are unlike anything I've seen before." "What do you mean?" I asked, stepping closer. She pointed to a patch of rock that sparkled faintly in the light. "Like these crystals, they look like they've grown recently. That doesn't happen underground. It takes thousands of years for formations like this to develop." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded and kept moving. James was behind us, snapping photos of everything he could. He had a good eye for detail. Too good. Maybe. Too. "Hey Howard," he called out after a while. "Come take a look at this." I turned back and walked over to him. He was holding his camera, frowning at the screen. I asked. "I don't know," he said slowly. "I took a picture of that tunnel back there, but look." He held up the camera so I could see the photo. At first glance, it looked normal. Just a dark tunnel with jagged walls, but there was something in the corner of the frame, a pale blur, almost like a figure. "Probably just dust or a trick of the light," I said quickly, though my stomach tightened as I spoke. "Yeah, maybe," James muttered, but he didn't sound convinced. We pressed on, mapping each tunnel as we went. The deeper we got, the stranger things became. Our compasses started acting up, spinning wildly or pointing in random directions, and our lights flickered now and then, even though we checked the batteries before leaving camp. Then there were the sounds. At first it was just faint tapping noises coming from somewhere or ahead of us. We thought it might be water dripping from the ceiling or rocks shifting. It's not uncommon in caves, but as we went further, the sounds grew louder and more rhythmic. It almost sounded like footsteps. "Probably just echoes," Rebecca said. When I mentioned it, she didn't sound worried, but I could see her gripping her hammer a little tighter. We found something else strange not long after: cave paintings. They were crude but unmistakable. Figures drawn in red and black pigment on the walls. They were tall and thin, with no eyes and long arms that stretched down past their knees. "Who made these?" James asked quietly. "No idea," Rebecca replied. "But they don't match any known indigenous art from this region." I stared at the figures for a long time, my heart pounding in my chest. They reminded me of something from my grandfather's journal, but I didn't say anything. By the time we made it back to camp that evening, something felt off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but the air seemed heavier, like the cave itself was holding its breath. The rhythmic sounds we'd heard earlier had faded, but the silence wasn't comforting. It was the kind of silence that makes you feel like you're being watched. Rebecca was busy examining the samples she'd collected, muttering to herself about their strange properties. James was reviewing his photos again, flipping through them one by one with a furrowed brow. I sat down on a rock and pulled out my grandfather's journal. I hadn't looked at it in years, but those cave paintings had brought back memories of his stories, the ones people used to laugh at. I flipped through the pages until I found a sketch that made my blood run cold. It was almost identical to what we'd seen on the walls earlier. tall, eyeless figures with elongated arms. Beneath the drawing, he'd written a single word in shaky handwriting, *watchers. Asterisk. I snapped the journal shut and shoved it back into my bag. I didn't want to scare Rebecca or James. And besides, there had to be a logical explanation for everything we'd seen so far, right? That night, I woke up to the sound of someone moving around. At first, I thought it was just James or Rebecca shifting in their sleeping bags. But then I realized it was coming from outside our camp. "James?" I called out softly. No answer. "Rebecca?" I grabbed my flashlight and stood up, shining it around the chamber. Everything looked normal. Our gear was where we'd left it, and there were no signs of anyone else nearby. But as I turned back toward my sleeping bag, something caught my eye. The map we'd been working on all day, it was wrong. The tunnels we'd marked were still there, but new ones had appeared, ones we hadn't explored yet. And some of the passages we had mapped were gone entirely. "Howard." Rebecca's voice startled me, and I turned to see her sitting up in her sleeping bag, rubbing her eyes. "What's going on?" "Nothing," I lied quickly. "Go back to sleep." But she didn't look convinced. The next morning, things got worse. Tony Rodriguez, a younger ranger who had joined us later that day for backup, claimed he heard his wife's voice calling him from one of the unexplored passages. "You're imagining things," I told him firmly. "It's common in caves. The echoes can play tricks on your mind." But Tony wouldn't let it go. "I'm telling you, Howard," he insisted, his face pale and sweaty. I heard her clear as day. I tried to calm him down, but he was too shaken to focus. Later that afternoon, while Rebecca and James were busy collecting more samples, Tony disappeared. We searched for hours, calling his name and retracing our steps through every tunnel we could think of. Finally, we found his camera lying on the ground near a narrow passageway. The strap was torn like it had been yanked off in a hurry. James picked it up and flipped through the photos on the roll. The last image sent chills down my spine. It showed Tony standing at the edge of the frame, staring into the darkness ahead of him. And just beyond him, something pale and blurry was reaching out. "Howard," James whispered, his voice shaking. "What is this?" I didn't have an answer. As night fell again, Rebecca started acting strange. She'd been handling some kind of fungal growth earlier, a glowing patch of moss-like substance clinging to one of the walls, and now she wouldn't stop scratching at her arms. "It's nothing," she said when I asked about it. But when she rolled up her sleeve later that night to check on a rash she'd developed, I saw faint patches of light spreading beneath her skin. That was when I knew this wasn't just another cave expedition. Something was down here with us, and it wasn't going to let us leave. We didn't sleep much that night. Tony was still missing. Rebecca was scratching at her glowing rash, and James kept glancing at his camera like it held all the answers. I couldn't stop thinking about my grandfather's journal, the drawings, the warnings. It all felt too real now. I didn't want to believe it, but deep down, I knew we were in trouble. The next morning, we decided to search for Tony again. We packed up our camp and headed toward the last place we'd seen him. The tunnels seemed different somehow. Longer, darker, like they were shifting when we weren't looking. Every step felt heavier, like the cave itself didn't want us there. "Howard," Rebecca said after a while, her voice trembling. "Do you hear that?" I stopped and listened. At first, I thought it was just the sound of our footsteps echoing off the walls, but then I realized it wasn't us. It was coming from deeper in the cave, a low, rhythmic hum that seemed to vibrate through the rock. "What is that?" James whispered. "I don't know," I admitted, "but we need to keep moving." We followed the sound until we reached a massive cavern unlike anything I'd ever seen before. The walls were perfectly smooth, like they'd been carved by something, not someone, but something. Strange structures jutted out from the floor and ceiling, almost like stalactites and stalagmites, but they were too precise, too symmetrical. In the center of the cavern was a pile of something. At first glance, it looked like a heap of rocks or debris, but as we got closer I realized it wasn't rocks at all. It was bones. Human bones. "Oh my God," Rebecca whispered, covering her mouth. James started snapping photos, his hands shaking so badly that some of them came out blurry. "What is this place?" he muttered. Before I could answer, we heard a noise behind us, a soft shuffling sound that made my skin crawl. We turned around slowly, and that's when we saw them. The pale ones. They were just as my grandfather had described, tall and thin with translucent skin that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. Their eyes were nothing more than sunken pits, and their movements were slow and deliberate, almost like they were gliding instead of walking. "Don't move," I whispered, holding up a hand to stop Rebecca and James from running. The creatures didn't come any closer at first. They just stood there, tilting their heads as if they were listening to something we couldn't hear. Then one of them raised a long, bony arm and pointed toward us. That's when the hallucinations started. I saw my son standing in front of me, my boy who died in Vietnam last year. He looked just like he had before he left for the war, young and full of life. He smiled at me and said, "Dad, what are you doing here?" I knew it wasn't real. I just knew it. But it felt so real that tears filled my eyes anyway. "Howard," James shouted, snapping me out of it. "What are you doing? We have to go." I blinked and shook my head, forcing myself to focus. Rebecca wasn't so lucky. She was staring blankly into the distance, her lips moving silently as if she were talking to someone only she could see. "Rebecca." I grabbed her arm and shook her hard. "Snap out of it." She blinked a few times and looked at me like she didn't recognize me at first. Then she nodded slowly and whispered, "We need to leave." But the pale ones weren't going to let us go that easily. As we backed away from the cavern, they started moving toward us, not quickly but steadily, and the walls around us began to shift. Passages that had been open moments ago were suddenly sealed off by solid rock, while new tunnels appeared where there hadn't been any before. "They're controlling the cave," Rebecca said in a shaky voice. "They're hurting us." Her words sent a chill down my spine because she was right. They were hurting us. Every turn we took led us closer to another massive chamber filled with strange cocoons hanging from the ceiling like grotesque ornaments. Inside those cocoons were people, or what was left of them. Some looked fresh, their faces frozen in expressions of terror or pain. Others were barely recognizable as human anymore, twisted and deformed by whatever process these creatures used to transform them into their own kind. "We can't stay here," I said firmly. "We have to find another way out." But Rebecca wasn't listening anymore. She had stopped scratching at her rash hours ago because now her skin was glowing faintly all over, just like theirs. "They're not trying to hurt us," she said suddenly, her voice eerily calm. "They just want us to understand." "Rebecca," I said carefully, stepping toward her, "you're not thinking straight." But before I could stop her, she walked straight into the chamber where the cocoons hung, and she didn't come back out. I wanted to go after Rebecca, but James grabbed my arm. "Howard." "No," he said, his voice trembling. "She's gone." I froze, staring at the chamber where she'd disappeared. He was right. I didn't want to admit it, but something about the way she walked in, calm, almost peaceful, told me she wasn't coming back. Not as herself, anyway. "We need to get out of here," James said urgently. "Now." The pale ones were still behind us, their eyeless faces turned toward us like they could see every move we made. I didn't know how they tracked us. Maybe it was sound, maybe it was something else entirely, but they were closing in. And the walls kept shifting, sealing off every path we tried to take. "Follow me," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I pulled out my grandfather's journal and flipped through it as we ran. His notes weren't just stories. They were a map. He'd been here before, and he'd left clues about how to navigate this place. "This way," I shouted, leading James down a narrow tunnel that sloped downward. The air grew colder with every step, and the rhythmic humming we'd heard earlier grew louder, vibrating through the rock like a heartbeat. We burst into another cavern, a massive one this time, even bigger than the last. In the center was something that made my stomach churn, a giant mound of eggs, each one glowing faintly with a sickly green light. The pale ones were guarding them, moving around the mound in slow, deliberate patterns, like they were performing some kind of ritual. "This is it," I whispered. "This is their breeding ground." James stared at the eggs, his face pale. "What do we do?" he asked. "We can't fight them." He was right. We couldn't fight them, but we could stop them. I reached into my pack and pulled out the explosives we'd brought for clearing blocked passages. It wasn't much, just enough to cause a small cave-in, but if I placed them right, it might be enough to bury this chamber and seal off the colony. "You're not serious," James said when he saw what I was doing. "Do you have a better idea?" I snapped. He didn't answer. I started setting up the charges as quietly as I could, praying the pale ones wouldn't notice us. James kept watch, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold his flashlight steady, but then something moved behind us. A shadow that wasn't ours. I turned around just in time to see Rebecca step into the cavern, or at least what used to be Rebecca. Her skin was glowing now, just like theirs, and her eyes, her beautiful blue eyes, were gone, replaced by empty pits that seemed to stare straight through me. "Rebecca," I whispered, my throat tight. "You don't have to do this," she said softly. Her voice was still hers, but there was something else in it now, something alien. "They're not our enemies. They're trying to survive. They're killing people." I shot back. "They killed Tony." "They didn't kill him," she said calmly. "They changed him. They're offering us a chance to be part of something greater." "No," I said firmly. "That's not living." She tilted her head slightly, like she didn't understand why I couldn't see things her way. Then she stepped closer, and that's when I saw her hands glowing faintly with the same fungal patches that had spread across her skin. "Rebecca," James said shakily, backing away from her. "Stay back." But she didn't stop. I had no choice. I pressed the detonator in my hand and shouted at James to run. The explosion ripped through the cavern with a deafening roar, sending rocks crashing down around us. The pale one shrieked, a high-pitched sound that made my ears ring, and for a moment, I thought we weren't going to make it out alive. But somehow, we did. When the dust finally settled, James and I were the only ones left. We stumbled out of the cave, coughing and covered in dirt. The entrance collapsed behind us, sealing everything inside. The pale ones, the eggs, and Rebecca. I wanted to believe it was over, but deep down, I wasn't sure. The official report blamed the deaths on flooding and a respiratory infection. The park closed off the cave system indefinitely. James tried to develop his photos, but they were mysteriously destroyed in a processing accident. No one believed us. Years later, a new ranger found glowing fungal patches near the park headquarters. He swore he saw a woman in the woods, her skin faintly glowing, whispering, "They found another way out."